I met someone on vacation who knew my life better than I did. I was traveling alone when it happened. Nothing dramatic at first. Just a short trip I booked last minute because I needed space from everything at home. New city, unfamiliar streets, no schedule. I told myself it was about rest, but really I just wanted to feel like a different person for a few days. On my second night there, I ended up at a small bar tucked away on a side street. It wasn't crowded. Soft music, low lighting, the kind of place where people mind their own business. I took a seat at the bar and ordered a drink, fully expecting to be invisible. That didn't last long. A few minutes later someone sat down next to me. Around my age. Friendly but not pushy. They commented on the drink I ordered, said it was a good choice. We made small talk. Where I was visiting from. How long I was staying. Normal conversation. Comfortable even. At some point they laughed and said, "You always pick places like this." I assumed they meant people in general. I laughed it off. But then they added, "Quiet, out of the way. Somewhere you can think without being bothered." That made me pause. I don't remember telling them that about myself. I asked what they meant and they shrugged. "Just a vibe," they said. We kept talking. The conversation flowed easily, almost too easily. They seemed to know exactly when to let silence sit and when to fill it. At one point they mentioned my job. Not just the field, the specific role. I asked how they knew, and they said I talk like someone who did that kind of work. It sounded flattering, so I let it go. Then they said my hometown. Not the country. Not the region. The actual city. I felt my chest tighten a little. I asked if I'd mentioned it earlier. They smiled and said, "You didn't. But you have that accent you only hear from there." That wasn't true. I don't have an accent. At least not one people ever comment on. But again I let it slide. I didn't want to be paranoid. I was on vacation. People meet strangers all the time. The turning point came when they said, "You didn't come here to relax. You came because you feel stuck." I didn't answer right away. They continued casually like they were talking about the weather. "You're not unhappy exactly. Just restless. You keep thinking you should be further along by now." That hit harder than I expected. I asked them how they knew that. They looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Everyone feels like that," they said. "Some people just hide it better." I wanted to believe that. But something about the way they said it felt too specific. We ordered another round. At this point part of me was unsettled but another part was curious. It felt strangely validating to be understood without having to explain myself. Then they mentioned something I had never told anyone outside my family. A personal detail from years ago. Not something you could guess. Not something you bring up by accident. I went quiet. They noticed immediately and said, "I'm sorry. That was too much, wasn't it?" I asked them directly how they knew that about me. They didn't answer right away. Instead they asked me a question. "Do you believe people can leave parts of themselves behind?" I didn't know what to say. They explained that when people travel, especially alone, they tend to talk more freely. To share things they wouldn't at home. That places hold memories. That sometimes when you return somewhere, or someone, you don't come back empty-handed. I laughed nervously and said I thought I'd had enough to drink. They didn't argue. They just nodded and said, "That's usually when people realize it." Realize what? I asked. That they've heard this before. That's when it clicked. Years ago, I'd been to this same city. Briefly. A trip I barely remembered. I'd gone through a rough period back then and spent one long night talking to a stranger in a bar. I told them everything. Things I'd since buried. Things I'd convinced myself didn't matter anymore. I looked at the person next to me and really studied their face for the first time. They looked familiar. Not in a clear way. More like a memory that never fully formed. I asked them if we'd met before. They smiled and said, "I was wondering when you'd remember." My heart started racing. I asked why they hadn't just said something earlier. They replied, "Because you wouldn't have believed me. You needed to hear yourself first." I stood up. I said I needed air. They didn't try to stop me. As I walked toward the door they called out, "You asked me back then if people ever really change." I froze. "I told you yes," they said. "But only if they're honest about who they were." I left the bar and walked for a long time. I didn't look back. The next day I went back to the same place. I told myself I just wanted closure. The bar was open, but the bartender told me no one matching that description worked there or had been there the night before. He said I'd been alone the whole time. I laughed awkwardly and didn't push it. I finished my trip without incident and went home. Life went back to normal. But something felt different. Quieter. Like a question had finally stopped echoing. A few weeks later, I was unpacking and found something in my bag that didn't belong to me. A small receipt from that bar. On the back, written in familiar handwriting, was a sentence. "You already know the answer." I still don't know if I met a stranger, a memory, or a version of myself I tried to forget. But I do know this. I came back from that trip changed, not because I found something new, but because I was reminded of something I'd always known.